So my name is Alex del Carmen, and I was born in Nicaragua in Central America. Been in the United States most of my life. Currently, I am an associate dean at a university by the name of Tarleton State University, which is part of Texas A&M. And I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Texas. I've been in Texas for now 27 years.
Wonderful. So good to have you on the podcast, Alex. I'm really happy that we have this opportunity to learn more about your journey and you've been in education for quite a number of years, so lots of experience that translates to wisdom that I hope we can take from this conversation. And I know that you have a particular focus in criminology, right? In fact, a PhD in criminology. So that's something also that I would love to hear more about and how that also ties into the work that you do as a dean, as you know, within that administrative position, that capacity within the university, and and all of the other activities and projects that you have on your plate. I know you're very busy, and you're doing a lot of wonderful things, and it's a pleasure to have you here. So, you mentioned, right, that there's a couple decades, right, being within the university setting and doing your work. I'd love to hear about this professional background of yours, kind of like what led you into, being a professor, and what kind of research, like what drew you to that as well. And you mentioned that you're originally from Nicaragua, so perhaps some like early influences as well from kind of your early years, and then catching us up to where you're at now. I know there's a lot to cover, but some kind of abbreviated version would be really wonderful and very insightful to get our conversation started.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity to be in your great podcast. I have heard and seen many wonderful things coming from you as well. So my journey started in Nicaragua, and essentially I was born to a father who was an architect, and my mother was a high school dropout. So it was quite a very different academic skill set from both of them, and little did I know, at the age of 12, that I was going to experience a civil war. I went through the civil war in Nicaragua. And interestingly, we came to the States, soon thereafter seeking asylum. And so when we asked the State Department to grant us asylum, they said, no, you're not politically connected, so you have to go back. And so we went back to Nicaragua, and I lived under communism for a couple of years, which was also, as I would call it, sort of a formidable experience for me because it really truly taught me a lot about the kind of person that I wanted to be. And what was interesting about it was that towards the end of the second year that we were there, I've always been kind of very nosy, which was my early signs of being, I guess, a criminologist. And so I went in there and I was looking through my grandmother's things, and I found this one piece of paper that had the U.S. flag on it and an American bald eagle on it. And so I took it to my dad and I said, Dad, what is this? And my father said, Oh my God, this is my mother, because his mother was Lebanese. And she came through Ellis Island, New York, and ended up in Nicaragua, marrying my grandfather there. And she had the good sense of inscribing my dad at the U.S. Embassy. And so we had no idea. So we had no idea my dad was an American born overseas. And so he went in there, paid his $50, and the next day he had his U.S. passport. And so we all were able to eventually come to the States. That was very much, in many ways, the foundation for who I became. I was always intrigued by behavior. Soon after my experiences in Nicaragua, I was also intrigued about why people do bad things, and also wanted to find out how to help people. So that led me to study criminology. I remember my first criminology class that I took as an undergrad. I just fell in love with it. I thought, what a great field to go into. It does allow you to not only be a professor if you end up with a PhD, but also be able to work as a consultant, with the FBI, with local law enforcement, and corrections, courts, etc. And so one thing was led to another. And eventually I ended up getting my bachelor's degree, then my master's, and then on to my PhD. When I finished my PhD, I came to Texas. I've been in Texas now for 27 years. And in the course of my journey here, I not only taught at a university here in Texas and became eventually department chair and then, full professor, which means that, I was tenured once and then went through that process again to become full. But then I was asked about 10 years ago to join another university, which is also in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is where I currently am at Tarleton State, which is part of Texas A&M system. And they wanted to start a PhD program for practitioners, which I always sort of dreamed of doing that. And so I ended up making the switch from UT Arlington to the A&M University to Tarleton. And I've been here now 10 years. We started a PhD program about 7 years ago. In fact, we just completed the first dissertation defense on our first PhD student that graduates now. And in the meantime, while I'm not working at the university, I do a lot of consulting work. I work with about 120 law enforcement agencies across the country. I do a great deal of consulting in the area of racial profiling. I've written a couple of books on that topic. And I've trained every chief of police in the state since 2001, continue to do that as well. And when I'm not busy, I work as a special master, which is kind of a designated, very specific job, almost like a chief of staff to a federal judge in Puerto Rico on the police reform case there. So I'm busy, but I love what I do. And so for me, it's not work. It's kind of part of who I am.
Yeah, that was amazing. And you have lived quite a life. And I love how beautifully you told that story, starting in Nicaragua and then now in Texas. But I mean, I'm sure that yeah, your father and mother are incredibly proud of you, given all that you've been able to achieve, and it's about impact, right? I mean, that's one thing from this program that we're both in at Harvard, about the importance of having impact on people and the communities that we serve, and it's very evident that through the university community that you're in, as well as just the state at large, and even Puerto Rico too, for that matter, right? Where you mentioned that also is where you're able to really support as a kind of chief of staff, as you said, right? With the work that they're doing there. I think that's amazing. And so there's a lot that we can dig into. And if we can maybe go back to the time that you spent in Nicaragua, I I wanted to ask a little bit more about the influences that your father and your mother had on you. That you said that one was an architect, right? So more schooling. But your mother, on the other hand, was a high school dropout. But I'm sure that both taught you so much. And so, what are some maybe values or maybe there's a particular experience that you can speak for each one of them that has influenced you to this day?
Yeah. So my father, he studied in the United States and then he went on to Europe to get his master's degrees. He speaks several languages, very, very smart guy, with a lot of degrees. And he inspired me to work hard and to essentially get an education. My mother was really the drive behind much of my exposure to the academic world. She was definitely a huge influence in my life, and she very often would say to me, you have to have an education. You have to have an education. Look at what it got me. I made a decision to marry your dad, and I dropped, back in the day, dropped out of school, and I could have completed my education. I could have been a nurse. I could have been a doctor, and so I always kind of saw in her regret, that she wishes that she would have been different for her. And she's also very strong, still alive, and she's very strong as a personality. And so I always was very much inspired by her devotion to the fact that we needed, my sister and I, both, I'm the oldest of three, that her and I needed to have an education. And so when we came to the States, we lived, the first time we came, we lived in Seattle, and I spoke zero English, at the time. And so what my mother would do is she would go and get to these books donated at the local church, and she would share them with my sister and I. They're both, all of them in English, and she would say, read them out loud. It doesn't matter that you don't understand it. Your ear will get used to the English language, and then you're also going to be paying attention to how you pronounce words and whatnot. She was a teacher. She taught us a great deal. And, proud to tell you, Scott, that my sister is an OBGYN oncologist at Mass General Hospital at Harvard. and she also has an appointment as a professor at the Harvard Medical School. And so here is someone that, both of us, we're learning English at a very young age, had the trauma of a war, and then lived under a very strict communist regime for a couple of years, and here we are, and I really think a lot of it, I attribute everything to God. I think God has given me the possibilities that have been presented in my life, but I also see that my mother was definitely the driving force that drove us to do what we ended up doing.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. It's always very touching to hear when people like yourself really have that deep appreciation for their parents, and then I think mothers have a really important role just in society, just at large, right? For really being like that first teacher, right? And that person who believes in the potential, unlimited potential of their children. And yeah, and it's true testament to her efforts to because now, as you said, like both you and your sisters, right, are doing so well and really, yeah, just like blossoming, right, as like intellectuals, but also as leaders in your own capacities within your fields. And I think that's amazing, right? The importance of education, cannot be overstated, right? So yeah, I appreciate that, and it resonates with me too, because my mom actually is from South Korea. She's an immigrant, and left the country when she was 16 and didn't know any English whatsoever, and she always felt like she was behind, right? That she didn't have the kind of education growing up in rural poverty back in Korea. And so for both my sister and I, that was the same thing. Like, you have to go to the library, right? And
Yep.
she didn't know what to do. So she would just take us to the library, and she would always just tell us, like, I hope you become avid readers. I hope you just learn and, study. And so, yeah, I think both of our moms are proud that we made it to a place like Harvard. But beyond that, just the place itself, I think it's the spirit, right? Lifelong learning. Um, so you mentioned about the important role of both of your parents, but especially in your early years, it was not easy growing up when the Civil War was happening. And for those who are maybe less familiar with that part of history, could you share really briefly kind of what was going on, and then also how did that affect you in a very personal way, right? Growing up in those like formative years, and then yeah, and then you had the transition to the US, but like maybe just a little bit of that history and kind of how that affected you.
Sure. So Nicaragua had a president, many regarded as a dictator, by the last name of Somoza, and he was in power for his family was in power for 40 years, with the backing of the United States, right? And so Somoza in 1978, he had many people that opposed him and opposed his regime and his power and whatnot. One of them was a guy by the name of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, and Pedro Chamorro was the head of the local newspaper, La Prensa. And this paper was very powerful. It was very critical of the government. So, equatable to the United States, it would be something like the New York Times, and so this paper circulated around the entire country and was oftentimes very critical of the government. There had been already threats against the editors of the newspaper and all the things that you see that happen in foreign countries, particularly, but sadly, it's happening to some degree now in the United States, where people that take a particular stance on something, then they're attacked, right? And so one day, on January 10th of 1978, Chamorro was walking apparently down the street, and he was shot and killed. It wasn't just a shot; it was multiple shots. Almost seems like there was a shotgun that was used or two to commit the murder. But everyone pointed the finger at Somoza. Everybody said, "You know what? You are the one that killed him because you hated his criticism. You hated all he did." And so at that point, politically and socially, Nicaragua began to sort of evolve into from a small group of individuals that opposed the Somoza regime or dictatorship, then started growing. and it started receiving now international attention. And that became a military component as well, where they started doing operations all over the country, these guerrilla types of operations, taking over governmental buildings and kidnapping politicians, killing some of them. And so as a result of that, by the time 7 or 8 months lapsed from the time that Chamorro died, we were in a civil war, in a full civil war. And what that meant for me was, in the small town, we lived in a small town called Jinotepe, and it was about 40 kilometers. Not America, we measure everything by kilometers, kind of like in Europe, and as opposed to miles. So roughly for the benefit of your audience, about 30 miles away from Managua, which was the capital of Nicaragua. So we lived about 30 miles away in a small little town that my whole family had lived there, forever. And so for us, what it meant is we would go to school, and then they would tell us to go home, right? So we would walk back home or run home, and then you would hear the shots, you would see the helicopters fly around, dropping bombs, in the neighborhoods. It was not uncommon to see, dead people in the streets, had been there for days and weeks, My hobby at the time was to pick up, bullet shells off the ground. And of course, I didn't know any better. I just thought, hey, I'm gonna pick them up and keep them. And in fact, I brought them with me to the States when I came here because they're always a reminder of that very difficult period of my life. But more than anything, what it did for me is it created a sense of insecurity that I wanted to, like every time I would hear a plane when we came to the States, I would crawl underneath a table because we were told to do that because we knew that they were bombing cities and neighborhoods. And it's amazing to me, and I've done a great deal of research on this now, of course, as a scholar, that the impact that violence has on a child, even if it's not violence directed at you per se, but just to be around it, right? And to be a witness of it. And so health-wise, physically, mentally, emotionally, it really does define you. And so it kind of also gives you a sense, Scott, that now in my life today, there isn't a problem that I see as a fatalistic problem, right? So because I've been through worse. And so it always gives you that perspective, right? So like when you talk to people and they're like, oh yeah, especially in my field where you see some people that think that they're tough and they walk around with their guns and their badges and all of that. And there's a lot of ego and a lot of testosterone in the room. I often see them and I just sort of shake my head and go, if you only knew, if you had only lived through something that I've lived through, you would know different, right? And so what it also does is it makes me appreciate the good things in life. I love the peace and quiet. I am a person that I am my ambience, even though I can be a very intense person when I like something or for instance, when I get into a particular subject matter, I want to just dive in and learn it. And then even in terms of my integrity, which you were asking me about earlier, in terms of my morality, my structure of who I am as a human being, it's very much the core of that, right? So it's my compass, and it's a non-negotiable for me. So essentially, I know where I stand, I know who I am. I don't have to prove anything to anybody, and having had that experience in my life has given me a grounding that I don't know that I would have had I experienced any other type of episode in my life. So
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex, for sharing that. I know that time of your life is traumatic, right? And it's difficult to think back on those times. Clearly, you've processed so much of it, and also used your career as a way to really not just understand what happened, but address it and serve a greater purpose, especially when it comes to understanding the role that justice plays within societies and how we can do our very best to ensure that something like a civil war and the kind of violence that springs from disagreements from whatever kind of like political circumstances that are kind of brewing under the layers, the societal layers, that there are these mechanisms to kind of trace it back to and really alleviate that so that suffering can like there can be less of the suffering. So I thought it's really amazing how you're able to kind of like identify these like experiences of like picking up, bullet shells and and be able to say like, I that's why I value peace and quiet now. And that you have like you carry with yourself, you carry this perspective, right? That you're like, you've seen the worst. And I thought that was really powerful as well. Like those who've really experienced the bitterness of war can truly savor the times of peace, right? Or can be able to have that, comparison of like, we have it good, but we can also make it better, right? Of course. So, I wanted to ask about, the word justice, right? I'm sure it comes up a lot in
Mm.
your field, in your line of work. And you even said that like one of the big questions that led you into the field of criminology was very simply, why do people do bad things? What compels them to do that? What circumstances lead them down that path, or other variants of it of that question. But I'm just curious, like how do you see like this word like justice? Like how do you articulate that first off, and then do you see that kind of play into like your role as an American citizen, and then also kind of if you can like take it to a larger scale as well, kind of working out this notion of like what a global citizen would mean as well within the context of justice.
Yeah. So justice, and I'm going to be a little bit of a college professor here, but justice comes from Emperor Justinian of Rome. And Justinian used to commission his artists to depict what we now know as the scale of justice, which is the idea that punishment balances with the offense that's been committed. There's never a disproportionate punishment up or down versus the actual weight of the impact of the behavior that was committed. And so for me, justice means a lot of different things, right? But essentially, principally, if you want to call it that, it really means restoring the damage of what somebody else has caused, more so than the satisfaction that that person has been caught and is being prosecuted, perhaps being imprisoned. It's about restoring to the victim what has been taken away from the victim. And that's easier said than done, right? Because there are a lot of experiences that victims go through, victims of crime particularly, that they can never get over. They'll never be the same. They'll never sleep well at night. They'll never feel safe in the streets of the United States. They'll never feel at all, that they're being protected. But I would argue that what is important is to recognize the type of behavior that leads to that offense, to try to prevent it as best as we can. And when we cannot prevent it, to make sure that we are able to get to that victim as soon as possible and stop the bleeding, so to speak, that we can actually get to the offender too, and either prosecute the offender effectively or do something so that the offender doesn't continue to commit that crime. So I'm a, I describe myself as a person that I'm a bleeding heart. I would do anything for anybody, and I always walk around with a dozen things to say that hopefully are good and will impact that person in a positive way. But at the same time, I also, when it comes to injustice, when it comes to the absence of justice, when it comes to corruption, when it comes to people that are doing things to exploit others, there's a switch almost that you turn on, that goes from the very compassionate person to somebody that wants to seek that justice, so that the victim can have a hope and a future, right? So I think a lot of it again, draws back to my childhood experiences, because I didn't have anybody do that for me. I mean, I was involved in a world in a foreign conflict. I mean, we didn't have 911 to call. We didn't have any of these things that this wonderful country affords and to others. And so it is that. And then secondly, which is a big part of who I am, is I love the United States. I think the United States, I mean, we have a lot of problems, unquestionably, and a lot of things that we need to repair, but it is the greatest country on the planet. And I will die believing that, because I really believe, as a first generation immigrant, that when I see that flag, flying anywhere in the US, and I feel that sense of pride that I'm from this amazing country where there are some amazing individuals like yourself that are doing amazing things and helping out others. What country in the world do you know that would package, thousands of items of food to send to a foreign land and people that they never met? What other country do you see people that question who they are and question themselves and question authority and the governmental component? I remember coming here, I asked a question about the government, when I was a kid, and I was so afraid of asking because I didn't want people to interpret that I was trying to challenge the government in some ways. And so I remember this one friend of mine in school looked at me and says, "That's the most American thing you've said." And I said, "What?" This is when you question whether or not the government should do certain things. This is that's the American way. And I didn't quite understand that back then because I was coming from Nicaragua, very different perspective. You were shot at if you were questioning the government. But then I realized that what they were trying to say is, that we can afford that freedom, that First Amendment freedom to ask, to be able to express our opinions publicly, as long as we're not harming somebody else.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It's I love that history lesson and like the discussion on justice. And I feel like that sometimes is missing when you're talking about kind of just law enforcement in general, the kind of like the underpinnings of that and, protect and serve, like we hear that. But in the kind of like political climate, especially in recent years, it's
Mhm.
been quite turbulent. And that's an understatement. But it's I think important to understand like the broader like societal like what's really at stake. And I think you did a really great job in framing that as like as a nation and like what we are trying to do and how we go about that process of questioning government, but then also recognizing that there's like this kind of equal force that then comes back, and there's this striving of what will emerge from that. That's very important, right? Because that's kind of what will be at the forefront and what a lot of other countries tend to kind of look at, right? To kind of catch a glance as like what is the US doing? I also think that the US has a lot to learn from other countries as well.
Mhm.
But again, to kind of speak of like where like the history of the US and what has been achieved and what continues to be going on, I do think that there's still a lot that is that is kind of emerging from that. And yeah, I wanted to ask this question. So, it's really the kind of like passion that comes with speaking about why the US is such a wonderful country, especially as a first generation immigrant. I hear that a lot from my mom. And oftentimes, my mom will just kind of share, back in Korea, it was just like misery and just hunger and suffering. Of course, South Korea is very different now. And she's been back and has realized, wow, like this is not the Korea that I know. Um, and I was wondering if you had a similar experience of going back to Nicaragua at any point since becoming an American citizen, and what your thoughts were about that. Like, what was that like for you? And I know it'd be different from my mom's, but kind of how did it feel like to kind of go between those two different cultures, knowing that you gained so much from both?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. And I will tell you, Scott, that I went back to Nicaragua several times, as an adult, and took my kids. I have two, I call them kids, but they're grown up now. But my son and my daughter, so that they could understand a little bit about the food that I ate or that I eat, that I like to eat, the music that I like to listen to, the cultural dynamics of Nicaragua, and they both loved it. They had a great time. We had kind of a peaceful democratic era in Nicaragua. And during that time, I was able to do all those things. Sadly, now they're back in the government now is back on the one that was, in power back when the communist regime was in place. And so there are a lot of issues that are challenges that are taking place right now in Nicaragua. But I will tell you that as far as the culture is concerned, I am very much connected to it. My sister, I think, is more public about that. I think she truly, feels that she is Nicaraguan first and American second. I think I'm the opposite, right? So I'm an American first, and my identity is with the United States. Like I said, I love my country. I love the people in it, and this is where I belong, right? But Nicaragua left not only the scars of the war and the traumas, but it also left a lot of good things, right? It left, I have a particular taste for the food, and now through the internet, we're able to order it online and able to get it from places like Miami and Los Angeles, where you are, and just you see a lot of Nicaraguan restaurants there, and Houston now the same thing, which is not far from where I live, and so there's always the connection to the food, and the food is important, and as you know, having ancestry or descendancy from South Korea, I mean, clearly, the food for you, I'm sure it matters, and the smell of the food and the ritual that comes with preparing the food, all of those things really culturally matter to me. Also, in addition to that, the music. I mean, there's every once in a while there's that melancholic moment where you sit back and you say, "Man, I just have to watch something from, in my case, from Nicaragua." So I would turn on the news, or I would watch a YouTube video of someone walking the beaches that I walked as a child. And there's that little part of you that is always there, always kind of poking in your heart, reminding you of the essence of who you've always been. While at the same time, there's a part of me that says, get over it, move on, and you're now in the States and live your life according to your new traditions. Right?
Wow. That last quote that you just said was really impactful for me because you're saying like, with all of these influences from Nicaragua, right, the imprint that culture has had and continues to have on you, it reminds you of the essence of who you had always been, I think is how you phrased it.
Mhm.
And but again, it's not to say that it overshadows other aspects of your identity, and you've made that very clear. And I think my big takeaway, especially in light of this notion of global citizenship, is I think, we can understand kind of who we are and the sense of identity and be able to kind of pull from different pots, right? Kind of like different influences or cultures in this case, and that it's additive, right? And that it all informs who we are, and that that maybe the word global kind of entailing something maybe larger or more encompassing, maybe in scale, suggests an expansive quality to how we understand the various different identities that we have, be that national identities, but also ethnic or racial identities, and a whole host of other identities that you affiliate yourself with, I love pickleball, right? Okay, sure. Like that can be an identity as well. And the list goes on. So I thought that was really wonderful and, made me think about when I spent a stint of time, about 6 years living in Brazil. I was teaching there. And, it's tough to adjust to a new culture, right? As you've experienced firsthand, especially growing up, right? You probably were like struck by why do I have to learn this like new language? And, or like why do we eat like why are there only certain like restaurants available in Seattle, like initially where you were, and like the food's different and everything. So I experienced that myself. And I think it was important for me to kind of really understand what it means to be an outsider in that sense. Of course, I was only there for 6 years, but I did come to a point where I felt this great affinity for Brazilian culture. But I always felt like, when I was kind of feeling homesick, I would find a Korean restaurant in São Paulo, Brazil. And that's where I was able to, like you said, reconnect with some kind of, sense of essence of who I am. But what's interesting is that when I left Brazil, I came back to California. Now, I could eat Korean food anytime and more frequently. But when I'm feeling homesick now, I mean, I get homesick of Brazil. Like yeah, when I'm feeling that way, I will eat Brazilian food now. And I just thought that was such an interesting like reversal of like, wow, like what's going on here? And I think it speaks to like um whether it takes you 6 years or it takes you 6 weeks or maybe, you know, 6 decades, right? I don't know. I'm not saying that's you, but I'm saying that like how long you spend in one place. I think we can have that like resonance with another culture and that opening to expand ourselves. So yeah, just wanted to add that comment. But I wanted to ask another question, and this relates to your research in criminology, the work that you do with law enforcement, consulting. So I know that has been, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the bulk of your expertise and the work that you've been doing and what you're very passionate about. And so I'm just curious, like, if there's any kind of like, you know, I don't know, recent like aha moments that you've had with interacting with law enforcement, and like how, the work that you do, I'm sure, is not just to identify what is wrong, but also to educate them in terms of how to approach situations so that they are, as you said before, preventative. But like, could you speak a little bit more about like the work that you do with different police chiefs, and kind of like what really like motivates you and inspires you in those interactions? And yeah, and are there any like recent aha moments or lessons that you took away from that? Just as you're quite that you are like the expert in this field, but like I'm sure you're still learning, with each year. So just like, yeah, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. So when I came to the States, as I mentioned earlier, we lived in Miami most of my high school years and whatnot. And Miami was kind of a bubble for me. It served as a place where I felt safe. I always say that Miami is a crazy place to be nowadays, but back in the day, it was just, if you were from a different country, if you were coming in speaking very little English or whatnot, guess what? You were among the millions of people that lived in Miami at the time. So nobody really singled you out because you looked a little different or you were from a different background. What ended up happening was that when I left Miami to go to Florida State, which is where I got my master's and my PhD from, which is in Tallahassee. It's about a 7.5 hour drive from Miami, north of Miami. The Florida Panhandle is a whole different world from Miami. Very conservative, in some ways, uneducated. Also, individuals that, at the time particularly, they were very expressive in their racism, and this is leading me to tell you a little bit about my area, right? So I remember my first day in grad school at Florida State, when one of my colleagues, students, came up to me and said, "Your name is Rojas." And I said, "No, my name is Alex." And he says, "No, no, your name is Rojas." And I said, "Why would he be Rojas?" And he says to me, "Because I've never met a Hispanic person whose name is not Rojas. And so your name will be Rojas from this point forward." That was day one, Scott. And then that afternoon, the professor, his name was Dr. Gould at the time, he's now deceased, but he taught us statistics, and he said to me, he says, "I need to see you in my office." And I said, "Okay." And so I went to his office. This is day one, like he barely knew my name, and so I figured it wasn't anything bad that I had done or turned in an assignment that he didn't like. And so he said to me, he goes, "Close the door." So I closed the door, and he goes, "I want you to know," he says, "that I don't want, I believe that some people in the classroom are being, weird to you because they've never seen a Hispanic person before here." He says, "And I want you to know that I'm not racist," he says to me, "that I want all of your people to be educated." And I said, "Sir?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "I want all of your people to be educated." And so, being the smart aleck that I am, I said, "Well, sir, I'll let my people know that your people want us educated. And maybe we can get both tribes to come together and smoke a cigar or a pipe." Trying to make fun of the fact that, what he had said was incredibly offensive. And I realized then, believe it or not, it took me all the way up to grad school, how in the United States racism was alive and well. And of course, no greatest source of power and authority than law enforcement, right? As a criminal justice component. So coming up in the criminology world, I began to naturally gravitate to try to understand, why some individuals in the police force, in this case, were antagonistic and angry and discriminatory towards the rest, that they did not look like them, right? And so that led me into doing research. And when I came to Arlington, Texas, which was 27 years ago, I volunteered at the police department. I literally walked across the street from the campus, and I said to the chief at the time, I said, "I'd like to volunteer." And he said to me, "Where have you been?" And I said, "Sir, I've been in grad school, but I'm finally here." And so I walked in and I rolled up my sleeves and I started doing research, data analysis on what we called at the time driving while black, which became later on racial profiling. And so that's what led me to that moment in my career. And then once I opened up that journey and that can of worms, so to speak, Scott, I followed it, right? Because I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is incredibly interesting, that you have people that have the authority to kill somebody under the law. And in some cases, albeit a few, they're still engaging in racism and discrimination towards others, and particularly depriving people of their civil rights. And so I thought, you know what? I couldn't do much in Nicaragua as far as taking the pain away from me and other people and down there. I couldn't do much, because I was a kid. I couldn't do much as far as the discrimination that I experienced growing up in the States. But I can certainly do something now with a PhD in criminology focused on that particular topic. And to this day, I mean, I've written 2 books on the topic. My book last year was cited in a first Court of Appeals federal case that was heard in the First Circuit, which is in Boston, ironically enough, right? And so I'm very proud of the work that I've done because I have always maintained my neutrality. I've never taken sides. I always tell people I'm not an activist. We need activists in the United States. We need activists in the world, but I'm not an activist. I'm an expert. And so I look at science, I look at data, and I interpret it. And sometimes the findings are going to make some people upset, but then, and other people happy, and then, or vice versa, depending on what the findings suggest. But ultimately, I owe that to my fellow citizens. Talking about global citizenship, I owe it to everyone in the world that sees my work and reads my work, and especially my children. I want them to one day be able to look back at their dad and say, dad didn't really have much. He started off as a very poor person in the United States, came here with nothing, no inheritance, no big wealth, no 401k, nothing. And he left for us, just a little bit of a better place than what he found when he came here. And that to me, Scott, is I live my life by that code. My code is regardless of what surrounds me, whether it's a nice house or nice cars or flying somewhere or giving a talk at a prestigious place, all of that is great. But ultimately, how I ground myself is every single day, either before I go to sleep or late into the evening, I always ask myself the same question as I have for years now, which is, what have I done today to make me proud or to make me satisfied in my last 2 minutes of life? Because ultimately, what matters most in the world is those last 2 minutes, because that's when everything, your whole world, your whole life is going to come right by you. And if the good Lord gives you the grace of dying in bed and being able to, sort of know that you're dying so that you can say goodbye to your loved ones and whatnot, it's not a sudden death. Having that time to just contemplate and say, what did I do to leave this world a better place? What did I do to leave ambassadors of the love that I have for others, around, whether it's colleagues like you, Scott, for me, or my children, or my wife, or my parents. What am I doing by leaving people behind? What are they going to say about me once I'm gone? And it's not that that matters per se, because what matters is what you take with you, but you definitely have to have in your heart the satisfaction that you've done your best. And that's certainly how I live my life. I always say, when I look at the rearview mirror in my life and I see what I'm leaving behind, I want to say, you know what? I may have not fixed anything, but I like to think that at the very least, they knew that I tried, and they knew that I left it just a little bit better than how I found it.
Those are inspiring words, and I think the questions that you raise are truly profound, and it really speaks to what it means to live a contributive life. And I think there's a deeper purpose for the actions and the work that we do, that it's not about us per se, right? But it's about, like you said, right? Like the friends and family that surround you. It's the communities that you serve, right? And expanding to the country, and then expanding yet again to the world, right? And yeah, having the last 2 minutes of one's life, or just living each moment, and having this sense of like no regrets, like I'm doing everything I can, and what impact that makes, who's to say? But you're doing the work, right? You're showing up. And I think that's really beautiful. And I really resonate with that myself. And to have a death like where you can say that with confidence and be surrounded by loved ones, I think is amazing. And 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 this kind of brings me to another point that I think is really important. I'd be remiss not to bring it up since you've mentioned the importance of God. And so, faith is really important in all of this. And so I'd love to hear just, what you have to say about that, the role that it's played in your life, and yeah, how it
Yeah.
maybe connects. Yeah.
Yeah, significantly. You know, my faith is my faith, right? But I keep it very close to my heart. I'm Catholic, and I was raised Catholic, but that today doesn't mean anything, right? So many people say I was raised Catholic, but I go to church once a year for Christmas or Easter. In my case, I pray the Rosary every day, every morning before I have any meetings. I pray my Rosary. I put myself in the hands of God and my children and my wife as well. People ask me all the time, and some people are intrigued by that. They say, "You're a bright guy. How can you believe in God?" And I said, "It is because I am bright that I believe in God, because I get to see the side that is opposite to God in my work. I get to see, people getting killed and, family violence and children being abused and all of the things that the other side, the opposite of God, right, is very active in this world. And so when people say to me, "Is it hard to believe in God?" I say, "No, not really." I said, because life is always has opposites to whatever is we have in place. When you have the heat, eventually you'll have the cool breeze of the fall. When you have the spring, you're always going to have, the summer. And so my point is that when you look at the counterbalance of life, when you see a whole bunch of bad things every day, you write about them. In some cases, when I served as a federal monitor in New Orleans on the police reform case, every time that somebody was shot and killed, we were at the scene. And so I got to see a lot of that. And as a kid, as I mentioned earlier, in Nicaragua, growing up there, you see violence in a way that is not manifested anywhere else. And so what you learn is that if the devil is present in those moments and in those days, well, God certainly has to be present on the others. And that's why I follow that line of thought, which is, I want people to know me and to know me as a child of God, not necessarily as somebody that is a PhD in criminology and now at Harvard. All those things are great, but in the end, what really matters, like I said before, is where's your heart, where's your soul. Are you ready to, and to really face the challenges that we all face every day. My kids are grown up now. My son is finishing medical school in a few weeks. My daughter is a BU law. She's in her second year finishing that. And they're both amazing kids. I mean, I couldn't have asked God for better children. But I really feel bad for parents of young kids now, because they have so many things to deal with that I didn't when my kids were growing up. I mean, I didn't really worry about an active shooter. I didn't really worry about COVID. Didn't really, I mean, all of those things were sort of circumstantial to me as a criminologist, but they were not part of my everyday existence the way that they are now for a lot of parents of little kids. And so I see that is inevitable that I believe in God, and it's inevitable that I hold him very close to me, and it is my moral compass. I mean, it's how I live my life.
Yeah, and I think that, your heart is definitely in the right place and that you are doing so much to help others, right? In the communities that you serve. And I think, when you're talking about your own children and saying that now you look to younger parents and what they're faced with, especially when, sending their children to schools and having to worry about, one example being active shooters. I think that really speaks to the depth of your empathy, right? That of course, in the scholarly work that you do and how you show up and speak to what's going on, there's that level of objectivity, but there's also, another dimension to that, the one of you being a parent, but then also the dimension of your faith, like being a person of faith. I think that really goes even deeper to what's really at stake here, and that like life is so precious. And yeah, and I just think that that's really important for us to keep in mind. So thank you for sharing that, and then also thank you for sharing about your faith. I really wanted to hear that part because it sounded, I mean, it's evident that it plays such an important role in your life, and in your family's life, and also it just sounded very similar to like the way you spoke about justice as like kind of this restoration of a kind of like righting wrongs, of restoring balance, in the way that you speak about your work as, seeing kind of the worst of humanity, but then showing up as, let's say the best of humanity to balance that, right,
Mhm.
on behalf of God, I think is really wonderful, and it parallels quite nicely, I think, from our conversation. And what a conversation it's been. We've covered so much, and there's probably so much more that you can share as well. But we are kind of coming to the tail end of our conversation, and I wanted to ask one final question that I asked to all of my guests, and it's a book or movie recommendation. In light of our conversation, what we've talked about, is there anything that kind of comes to mind that either you've read or watched recently, or something that you come back to frequently that you think would be great for the listeners to be aware of and maybe check out?
Yeah, you know what? Probably one of the most impactful books that I have ever read is called Night by Eli Wiesel. And Wiesel was received the Nobel Peace Prize. And Night is a three-part series. And it really talks about, it's kind of like an autobiography of when he was in Auschwitz, as growing up in Poland as a Jew. And there's a certain passage that I want to drive your audience to, when he talks about his father. Eli does, and he says, I lived, a rather, shelter life, and he says the Nazis had invaded or had taken over my town. He says where I lived, and the next door neighbor comes in and talks to my dad and says, "Hey, so and so, I don't know what the big deal is about these Nazis. They're really great people. In fact, they have the guy that is renting the upstairs room from us, gave me a box of chocolates last week." And he says, Eli is narrating this conversation between this lady and his dad. And then he says, and then she went back to her place. 3 days later, she was shot and killed by the same guy that had given her the box of chocolates. And his point in saying this was, he says, no matter how many times I tell that story, he says, to my children and my grandchildren, they just kind of listen to it and they move on. And he says they don't really understand what that means. And to some degree, Scott, that's been sort of the trajectory of my life as well, which is that when you go through some of these very difficult experiences, you want to transmit that experience to your loved ones so that they know what those signs are when you have racial intolerance, when you have people condemning you for speaking the truth, when you have people making up things, and the attacks, right, that are formed against people that want to bring light to a dark room. And oftentimes, my kids growing up, they were just like, "Oh, Dad, it's not a big deal." And and I think about what Eli used to say in the context of how, it's sort of the, like, if you want to call it, the predicament of our lives, which is that we can never pass on the experiences that we've lived so that the next generation doesn't make the same mistakes as the previous one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that book recommendation. And that is a great book. I have read it myself, and I think it speaks to like the capacity for certain human beings uh, to commit such atrocities. And then, like you said, right, how we can learn from that history, that's not far away at all, and really look out for, like, these current and future generations. So thank you for that. And it's just been such a joy learning about your story, and all the trials and tribulations, but the joys and victories that you've had, and that you've done so much, but it still sounds like you're just getting started. And there's a lot more in the rearview mirror to come. So I really appreciate you, Alex, for taking this time. And I wanted to give you the final words just to wrap up our conversation.
Well, first and foremost, thank you. I'm incredibly honored to be part of your podcast, and a person like you reminds me of why some of us get up every morning to do the work that we do, because you're the inspiration for many people. And no doubt that you will, along with your generation, change the world to be a better place. And so thank you for having the space in which you do that. And then secondly, remember to study hard. Because we have exams coming, and we have lots of things that you and I share, and I'm sure some of your audience members are feeling the pain that we feel as well. But keep up the great work, Scott, and thank you again, and thank you to the listeners on today's show.